that off of that, Suzy,
Yeah.
one of the things that occurred, and it's not just with Barney Frank, but it occurred within the public dialogue over the last 10 or 15 years, is the concept that everyone in America should be able to afford a home.
Yeah.
And yet the reality is, if you are real, some people just can't afford to own a home.
Yeah, I think about this, the language became deserves. Every American deserves a home. But I don't know, when I graduated from college and my parents said, the gravy train is over, and I moved down to Miami and I would made $300 or less a week and I was living paycheck to paycheck, I rented. I didn't deserve a home. I couldn't afford one. And there was a change in mentality. And it wasn't just Barney Frank, although he was very responsible. I remember George Bush giving a speech where he said, it's the American right to own a home. Well, some people can't own homes. Yet, we would hope that they could eventually own homes, but it's not a given that if you pay taxes, you own a home.
Why do you think it is, though, as your husband just said, that in all the recriminations of the past 4 or 5 or 6 months, that the big fingers are pointed at mortgage brokers, most of them now out of business, small mortgage brokers, and yet the editorial yammering constantly in many, many newspapers about the banks brought us to this point of collapse. And very few people write or talk about what you just spoke to, about government's role and everybody can own a home.
Well, 2 reasons pop right to mind. One is that bankers are very easy villains. Everybody hates bankers. They appear to not sweat or do any hard work, and they make a lot of money. And in college, they were the dumb fraternity boys. What are they doing running the banks and making all that money? And then the second reason is that the people writing the stories, Mike, our journalists, Mike, who tend to be liberal, Mike. And it's just that, they're not gonna, point the finger at their people that they voted for.
Now that gets to another interesting point, having nothing to do with liberal, and it is this, and we'll ask your husband first. Could you comment on what many people perceive to be the level of financial illiteracy among people who cover business for major newspapers, but more especially people in Congress, on the House and Senate banking committees, where if you ever watched any of the hearings where they question the bankers or the automobile manufacturers, these imbecile congressmen, you wouldn't let them have an ATM card. But Jack, go ahead.
I think you summarized it nicely. Again, we had some Massachusetts folks, Mr. Lynch, and some other fellow who really performed in those hearings. Embarrassing that you were from Massachusetts while watching those clowns performing. It was awful.
Yeah, it was
awful.
It was embarrassing. One of the questions that you get most often, and I'll save anybody from asking it here, is the length and the depth of this recession. What do you see when you look out your economic window? What do you see happening?
I think we're in the bottom of a bathtub. The bathtub that we're at the bottom of it. I see in and I'm sure you've all got views of this out there, but we see certainly a decelerating decline. Most people are seeing orders in the businesses where we're in, since we're in 11 private equity businesses, and we have seen since mid-January orders stay at that level. We haven't seen them pick up or go down. So the average order rates February, March, and April have been equal to the mid-January levels. And but what I can't give you is the back-end shape of the bathtub. I don't know. I honestly am frightened to death with the policies I see. We have a forecast of a deficit of $13 trillion. That's if we grow at 4% a year for the next decade. The deficit will be $13 trillion. To give you some perspective on 4% GDP means to you, we have never grown in the 90s, in the 80s, in the 70s, in the 60s at 4% over a decade. So the whole forecast is based on a thing that can't happen. So now assume we grow at 2.5%, because we've got a much more frugal consumer today. Everyone is hunkering down a bit. Every one of you at this table, the 3 of us up here, have all hunkered down a bit. there's been a shock to the system. Everyone wants a bargain. You don't go to a store without looking for something off, etc. Saks is going to be down this year 10%. Home Depot down 9% in volume. How are you going to grow 10%? Assume you grow at 2.5%, which is the average of the 80s and 90s together. Those were pretty good years. If you grow at 2.5%, your deficit goes to $30 trillion, not 13. The gross domestic product of this country is 13 trillion. You would have a debt 3 times the gross domestic product. So something has to happen. Obama throwing everything at the wall and hoping some sticks has to stop. Tax rates have to go to 60, 70, 80% for the top end, or else the game is over. And those numbers were in America 40 years ago. So these aren't numbers that won't come back again. So we can't afford what we're doing. We can't afford it. And so you worry about the shape on the back end. I think we'll have a recovery. The question is how sustainable, how long, how good. But the numbers don't add up. And as Suzy said, we're getting the government we voted for. So that's what we get. And if this in fact happens, we're going to have a different country. And entrepreneurs are going to have trouble, and all these things are going to be under pressure because you can't live with a deficit 3 times the gross domestic product of the country. $30 trillion in debt. It'll take all the payments of taxes to cover the debt payment.